those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt Edlhuber. I am a Converged CSM. I largely cover health and life sciences customers here at Microsoft, but this feature shared calling that I'm going to speak about here today does, pretty much apply across the board. So from an agenda perspective, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about, what is shared calling. Obviously, there's been some hype about this. I did one of our community events about this back in December. We're going to talk about how it works. I'm going to show you exactly how to enable this via, demo. We're going to talk about a few design considerations. We're going to look at some good use cases for this feature, talk about a few deployment concepts, and then, I've got a few frequently asked questions. And of course, we'll get to any Q&A for those of you out in the crowd. All right, so what is it, right? So this is a relatively new feature, came out back in September, that essentially allows multiple Teams users to share a single phone number. So pretty much fully functional, these users are going to be able to make and receive calls. They're going to have all the wonderful things that come with Teams phone. The really only difference is that, they won't have a dedicated number or DID number. So the main benefits of this is it does allow kind of a simplified deployment experience with, reduction of administrative overhead. Again, I'm going to go through a demo to kind of show you how to do this, kind of from a minimal effort type approach. We do have multiple methods of PSTN connectivity that are supported here. So, I do like to emphasize from a calling plans perspective, it does need to be of the pay-as-you-go type. If you are using Operator Connect, you should validate with your operator to make sure that they do support this capability. And then direct routing, as far as I'm aware, right, full featured functionality there. And then from an emergency calling perspective, if you're operating in the United States, there's quite a few, legal requirements around how organizations operate, manage, and deploy multi-line telephone systems, which includes Teams. Shared calling does fully support dynamic E911. So let's keep moving along here. Why are organizations adopting this feature called shared calling? And, a lot of it has to do with modern calling behaviors are kind of changing. Teams to Teams calling is, pretty prolific. I think, Microsoft has 300 or 400 million users on the platform today, and users demonstrate a preference, right, for utilizing Teams to Teams. If I need to call J-Dub or Don, call them on Teams. A lot of the customers that I interact with externally, right, typically we may be chatting and I call them on Teams. Scheduled calls, right, AKA Teams meetings. A lot of work today is just done through Teams meetings. Meetings are interactive, inclusive, a lot of added features. So people are busy. Depending on, what your job role is, there's a lot less ad hoc calling compared to 5, 10, 15 years ago. Some users have light PSTN usage, right? Myself included. I refer to myself as a Teams phone guy. I have relatively light usage. Occasionally I'm calling, maybe some of the vendors or partners that I work with over the PSTN. But some organizations look at this closely and it could impact, they might be reducing, giving voice services when we're talking PSTN to users as they're doing their deployment. So shared calling can help minimize some of those costs, make it easier. And then the need for direct dial phone numbers is also changing. So depending on your provider, there could be E911 service fees associated with that, cost of DIDs. Sometimes it's sent, sometimes, maybe there's not numbers available. So again, shared calling can help close some gaps there. So when we look at the benefits of shared calling, it does allow organizations to accelerate their deployments. And again, we're going to look at some specific examples of how we are seeing organizations transform, in days and weeks rather than years. It does allow organizations to modernize that calling experience when we, pair the Teams phone up with Copilot. Simplification of your deployment, right? It does allow organizations to maybe combine, reduce, phone number requirements. Every organization I pretty much work with, managing numbers is always kind of a tedious task, managing a spreadsheet somewhere, right? Occasionally an organization might have a tool to do it, but anything we can provide administrators to simplify number management, to me, is a added bonus. Realization of value, right? We talk about this a lot. Organizations invest in Teams Phone, maybe through E5, and it could take sometimes years to get that enabled, right? With shared calling, we'll talk about the concept of reverse migration, turning it on for everyone, helping organizations realize that value almost instantaneously. Versatility, this feature does work with shared devices, Teams rooms. We'll talk about that a little bit further. Cost savings, kind of already hit on that a little bit. Great fit for low usage, Teams users. Resiliency. Occasionally we see, cellular networks fail, maybe PBX failures. If you have a data connection, right, Teams Phone could maybe fill a gap there for the right, scenario. Risk-free pilot, right? You can easily turn this on, assuming you have the license, in parallel to existing platforms with, relatively minimal impact. Scalable, single shared calling policy, supports up to 10,000 users. And then flexibility, right? To me, this is probably one of the biggest benefits. It is just a new tool in the toolbox. For years it's always been every user needs a DID. Now we have some added flexibility. We can take a little bit closer usage on who needs those and who doesn't, and look for the opportunity to optimize and simplify. Here, this is just a little graphic that I like to use when I'm reviewing this solution with customers. Dedicated calling where each user has a DID, right? Kind of the 5 main components. We've got a user account or identity. We've got that Teams Phone license. In this example, I'm referencing E5. Could be standalone, could be Teams rooms, what have you. We've got a bunch of Teams policies that kind of configure that user experience. We've got a PSTN service. Maybe that's direct routing. Maybe it's Operator Connect, right? We have choices there. And then we have that phone number. And with shared calling, it's really those 2 bottom layers that become, the shared component of this feature. So how does it work? So when we look at this experience, right, let's say I pick up my iPhone, I call a PSTN number, the shared number in this case. Ultimately, on the Teams service side, that number is going to be mapped to a Teams resource account with that shared number assigned. And, the way the feature is designed is this would typically be associated with an auto attendant with the dial by name experience enabled. A little bit later, I'll talk a little bit further, right? We can customize this. Again, I said how the feature is designed, right? Designed with intended purpose. Dial by name auto attendant, say the name of the person you'd like to reach, and you will be connected. So if I call this number, I say, I want to be connected with Jonathan Wynn, it's going to connect me to Jonathan Wynn. Jonathan would answer in his Teams app, just like normal. From an outbound calling perspective, let's say we've got 3 users enabled for shared calling. Jonathan decides to place a call out to the PSTN. And when Jonathan places that call, the shared calling policy will leverage that resource account. The resource account would have that shared phone number assigned to it, and it's also going to have that PSTN connectivity method. Could be a calling plan, pay as you go, and that is how that call is ultimately delivered to the PSTN, and my iPhone will start ringing. So pretty straightforward there as far as how the feature works. I do like to call out that when we, from an IT admin perspective, get into the PSTN usage reports, we will see a newer call type here. In this example from my lab environment, I'm using direct routing. So we can see that, it's showing dr underscore shared out, direct routing, shared calling out. But we still see the user Peter here, who is the one who placed the call. From an IT admin perspective, we can click on Peter's name. We can see all Peter's call analytics, CDRs, etc. So no lost functionality there, but maybe you want to understand, right, how much usage is a certain, shared calling being utilized in your environment when you're first turning it on, right? You want to kind of monitor that a little bit. Using the PSTN usage report is an excellent way to do that. So this is how dynamic emergency calling works with shared calling. Diagram looks kind of similar to what I was showing a couple slides back with regular calling. This, in my opinion, is what I refer to as traditional ELIN. So in this example, user 2 signs into Teams. We have our location services detected, right? Maybe the user goes into a corporate location. The endpoint is basically talking to the trusted IP address, and we're doing some matching with the location information services in Teams, and we know where that user is. When user 2 dials 911, when we set up the shared calling policy, again, I'm going to kind of go through how we set all this up. When we set up a shared calling policy, we do have the ability to define what we call emergency callback numbers. And in this case, we've got 2 emergency callback numbers defined. When user 2 places that outbound call, one of these numbers will be allocated, and that will be represented in the form of the caller ID. We do want to have PIDFlow enabled, so that's a carrier-based feature to support E911 and pass that location information along, assuming we're operating in the U.S. here. And basically, that calls routed to the PSAP. In the event that the PSAP gets disconnected from the caller, essentially the PSAP is going to call back that shared emergency callback number. And essentially the team service is intelligent enough here to know that, it's going to hold that number basically for 60 minutes. It's going to look for any inbound calls. If any inbound calls come back to that emergency callback number, the team service will know, hey, that was user 2 that placed the call. So PSAP will ultimately be routed back to user 2. Again, that's held for 60 minutes. One of the common questions that we get asked, well, what happens if there's no free emergency callback numbers? Maybe there's some kind of a crisis going on, high 911 utilization, all the numbers are exhausted. Basically, if there are no free numbers available in the list, teams will reuse a phone number from the list. If the list is empty, essentially teams will use the resource account as that number. So that is essentially how shared calling works with emergency calling. We still need admins and organizations to basically populate and configure 911 just like you would for a regular dedicated calling user. So you set up your emergency addresses, location information services, etc. So not a lot of difference there other than just kind of how those emergency numbers are kind of allocated and utilized. So how do we enable this, right? So here I've got a very high level kind of punch list of the steps. But again, I'm going to flip over to my lab here and we're going to go through this in real time. So essentially, tenant setup, that's kind of where the bulk of the work is going to happen, right? So we're going to create and license a Teams phone resource account. Typically, I'm going to use the auto attendant type of resource account, right? We have 2 types, auto attendant and call queue. We are going to assign a phone number to the resource account. In my example, I'm going to demonstrate using direct routing, so that user is going to have an online voice routing policy. Then we'll go ahead and create that shared calling policy, and that is the step where we essentially assign those emergency callback numbers. We will create an auto attendant that is enabled for the dial by name directory search. And we're also going to associate our resource account to that auto attendant. So when we call that, shared number, it's going to be delivered to that auto attendant. And then the additional piece on the auto attendant is we will show you how to scope the dial by name directory. So when you call that shared calling policy number, ideally you're only going to reach the users that are associated with that policy, not the entire Teams directory for your organization. And then we'll also create a caller ID policy just so we're making sure that outbound calls are masked with that shared number. So that's kind of the tenant setup. And then we also have the user setup, which is going to involve basically making sure that the user has a Teams phone license. They need to be enterprise voice enabled. And then essentially we assign the shared calling policy, caller ID policy, and any additional, Teams phone related policies that you may need to configure in your environment. That could be dial plan, emergency calling policy, etc. So we will dive in there. And then the other piece that I'm going to actually, before I dive into there, initially when we launched this feature, it was only available to be configured through Teams PowerShell. I want to say a couple months ago, we did add the support into the Teams Admin Center to do this. So here I've got a couple screenshots of the shared calling policies tab. And then, within a policy, you can see kind of where we affiliate a resource account. We can see some of the details of this as far as, number, address, emergency callback numbers, etc. And then the other piece that I'm going to hit on during the kind of demo is the policy assignment piece. So I do think this is the piece that really helps organizations kind of streamline the deployment of this. And really it starts with a single group. So you create a Microsoft 365 group. We're going to assign all of our relevant Teams phone policies to that group. And then essentially once we have a Teams phone user, make sure they're licensed, enterprise voice enabled, and then all you have to do is drop them in the group and they basically pick up all the configs. So that really helps streamline all of that. So let's get right into it. I did put kind of a high level scope here of kind of just a scenario, I guess you could call it. So in this case, we're going to open a branch office in Morrison, Colorado. We're going to have 7 Teams users and 4 meeting room devices. We're going to assume that those users are using E5 licenses. We're going to assume that those meeting room devices are going to be using the Teams Room Pro license. And for this particular deployment, we're going to use one DID for the shared number. We are going to use one DID for the emergency calling callback number. And then we're going to go through creating the shared calling policies and the caller ID policies. And then we're basically going to link all that together through an M365 group using group policy assignment. And then from an enablement perspective, we'll just make sure that the Teams phone licenses are assigned to the users. We enterprise voice enable them, and then we simply just add them to the group, and the rest pretty much just kind of happens. So let me stop sharing this. And let me share my screen here. And we'll see how the demo gods are treating me today. So first things first. So I'm going to demonstrate a lot of this using PowerShell, but I'm going to also kind of go through the Teams Admin Center and kind of show every step of the way that we're kind of going through this. So first piece that I'm going to do is I'm going to create and configure the auto attendant resource account. So if we are in Teams Admin Center, we can drill down to resource accounts. We can click add. We can populate a display name, a username. We can select our domain. And then again, the way the feature of shared calling is designed, typically we're using an auto attendant as the resource account type. Let me just reset here. So from a PowerShell perspective, we're essentially running the new CS Online Application Instance commandlet. We're going to specify our user principal name or UPN. Again, this pretty much mimics kind of what we just saw in the Teams Admin Center. And then from an application ID perspective, there are two types that are documented out on Microsoft Learn. This is the auto attendant application ID. This is consistent number for all auto attendants in Teams. There is a different application ID for call queue. So you want to make sure if you're using PowerShell to create a call queue, right, you'd pick the other application ID. And then we're basically going to just give that a display name. Let's make sure I'm connected to Teams first. Let's try that again here. What's a good demo without a couple misfires here, right? Come on. All right. Try that again. Oh, somehow my domain name got changed here. Hang on. I swear I rehearsed this about 100 times. All right. Take two. All right, that looks a little bit better. So again, new application instance, UPN, application ID, display name. We see that that is created. So if I come out to our resource accounts tab, we're going to do or AAUS. So that has been created. We can see that Teams intuitively gives us a couple warnings here. Next piece we need to do is essentially, we do need to set the the usage location. So I'm going to also do that through PowerShell here. Of course. All right. So now that that is done, we're going to hop over to Microsoft 365 admin, and we are going to assign a license to that resource account. Again, TAC was kind of showing us an error there. This resource account does need the Teams Phone resource account license. So now this will take maybe a minute or so for both of those to update. Actually, I haven't assigned the phone number yet, so that one will still be showing unassigned, but it is critical that we have that license assigned before we can actually assign a phone number. So the next piece that we need to do is essentially we're going to run, I'll show you in TAC, if we need to assign a phone number here, we can essentially do direct routing is how I'm using that, right? And then we can basically punch in number using PowerShell. One other component that we need to do is reference the location ID. So there's a couple ways we can do that. I've set up, a handful of emergency addresses in my lab environment here. So in this case, we're going to use this address. I've already set up a location for Morrison, Colorado, which is going to be this one down here on the bottom. And let's go ahead and look at the commandlet to do this. So I've got a little note in there for myself to make sure that we update the location ID. It does look like it matches here. So we're doing this set phone number assignment commandlet. We are referencing the identity or UPN of our resource account. We're specifying location ID. And then we're going to add the shared phone number, and we're going to specify the number type as direct routing. So let's see if that is happy. Okay, that looks good. Let's go back over to TAC here. I'm going to impatiently hit refresh here and see if that picks up the change. Okay. So now we've got my resource account. We have a phone number assigned. The next piece that we're going to do is I do want to give this resource account the ability to place outbound calls. So we can do that one of two ways, right? In my case, I'm using direct routing. So much like a regular dedicated calling user or Teams user, where we would assign a voice routing policy to that user. We can do that using this menu inside of Teams Admin Center. Or, again, like I like to do things in PowerShell. First, I'm going to pull back that list of my voice routing policies. And then we're going to go through and we're going to do a grant CS Online voice routing policy. We're going to specify the policy name. So I'm going to use my domestic voice routing policy. Again, we're going to specify the identity of the account that we want to grant that policy. So at this point, our resource account is largely configured. The next piece that we're going to work on is going into the shared calling policy, and we are going to create a policy. So again, I want to kind of just show you how we would do this in Teams Admin Center, and then we'll actually do it in PowerShell. So we can give this policy a name, can give it a description. We do have the ability to associate with a resource account. I like to, you may have seen when I created my resource account, I had a prefix AA. I like to do that just from easy searching and tagging kind of through Teams Admin Center. From an emergency callback number, so in this example, in my home lab, I'm using a carrier called Edlhuber with a SIP trunk connected to an AudioCodes SBC. For this emergency callback number with my carrier, there is a little checkbox. I go into an online portal, I grab a free DID. I do make sure that that phone number is enabled for dynamic emergency calling. And then essentially, you can add that number through the Teams Admin Center. The one important thing to make sure is if your shared calling number is of the type direct routing, your emergency callback number must be of the type of direct routing. So your shared number and your emergency numbers must be of the same PSTN connectivity model. That is a requirement. And then here, as we're adding this in, we'll basically just, type in the number. So I'm going to jump out of that, come back over to PowerShell, and I'm going to do these kind of like one at a time, just so we go nice and slow here. There are a couple steps for this piece. So the first step is to actually get, I think it's pulling that, we're specifying that resource count as a variable. And then here I'm going to go through, and it's going to be a new CS team shared calling routing policy. I'm going to give it an identity. I'm going to specify the resource account. And then here we have the ability to add those emergency numbers. So this can be, multiple numbers. And then I'm going to give it a description. All right. So now if we come back to shared calling policies, let's do a refresh here. There's my policy. I can click on this and we see that I've got my fully licensed, number assigned, direct routing style resource account. And then we can also see that here's my emergency callback number. So the next step would be creating a Microsoft 365 group to start kind of connecting, right, these different policies. One second. To the users that ultimately I want to enable. So that's where this group policy assignment piece comes in. And see, I've already got a couple other groups linked to this, various shared calling policies. So in my case, I've got my group created already. So I'm not going to actually go through that particular step. But the next piece that we're going to do is actually building the auto attendant. I can get over here. So from an auto attendant perspective, this is pretty lightweight. Give it a name, operator is optional, set your time zone, enable voice inputs, do this through PowerShell. So I'm just going to kind of skip through this kind of rapidly. And then basically your menu option is essentially going to be, please say the name of the person you'd like to reach. So let's do that actually in PowerShell. The reason I show PowerShell is because, in my opinion, organizations are probably going to maybe have a number of these policies, right? And we'll talk about some of those design considerations, but that's one of the questions that, customers ask us, how many policies, Matt, might I need? And I'll say, well, that depends, we'll get into that, but let's just single policy first. All right, so the first piece when using PowerShell to build an auto attendant, essentially set that menu prompt. And then we're going to create the auto attendant menu. It's going to be the default menu, and we're going to enable dial by name, and the directory search method is going to be by name. So that's kind of what I just showed in the Teams Admin Center. Next up, we're going to create the default call flow. We are going to add in the dial by name directory scope. So this is where we can, actually, I'll go back to the auto attendant and show that. Let's see. Dial scope. So this is kind of in my opinion, a key piece to just make sure that we get this right. So again, if you've got 5 users in a shared calling group, or like this example that we're working through 7, if I call those 7 users in the Morrison, Colorado, or if I call the shared call number in the Morrison, Colorado office, my expectation would potentially be, again, as the feature is designed, reach one of those 7 users, right? So we would create a custom group. Again, we're going to stitch all this kind of together using a single Microsoft 365 group. And we only want to reach the people in the shared calling policy, right? We might not want to reach the entire Teams directory for your organization, right? Some of my customers have 100,000 users in their environment. If we've got the Morrison branch with 7 users, we might not want to reach all 100,000 in the organization. So key piece there to, again, just build this to meet your design specifications. Again, this is kind of just linking that group to the auto tenant. I have here wrong group ID, maybe. Probably. Try that one more time. Unless my group ID is wrong. Double check. No. I think that's my problem. One moment. Yeah, let's do this. There we go. All right, so that kind of links the group to the auto attendant, and at this point, now we're basically, you know, building the auto attendant. We're selecting the default call flow that we built in a, you know, an earlier step. We're setting the language, time zone, inclusion scope, etc. So now let's go back to auto attendant. I'm going to hit cancel here and discard those changes. So at this point, we have an auto attendant. We can see no operator. I've got, you know, Arizona time here. We've got voice enabled input. We've got a menu prompt. We've got a greeting. It's set to dial by name. We're open all the time. So anytime someone calls this, that behavior will happen. And now we've got our custom group. So only the users that are members of this group are going to be the only people that are accessible through this dial by name auto attendant. Now, the one piece you may have seen is at this point, I have not associated any resource accounts. So again, if I'm doing this through Teams Admin Center, AA-US, pick Colorado. If we want to do that through PowerShell, we can essentially grab the application instance of our UPN for a resource account. Yeah, that's basically connecting the two there. So if I hit refresh here, we should see that come together. And then the last piece around this is going to be the caller ID policy. So we want to make sure that any Teams user that is a member of the shared calling policy, when they place an outbound call, we're going to present, again, the way the feature is designed. I keep saying that over and over, right? Because this can be highly customized, but the way the feature is designed is we would then mask that outbound call with the shared number. Therefore, we need to essentially create a caller ID policy, and we will associate that with a resource account to our shared calling number. So again, we're going to do that through PowerShell here. So we are referencing the object ID of our resource account. We're going to create a new calling line identity, give it a name. Substitute type is going to be that resource account. A few other parameters. We can give it a company name if we want, and then a description. All right. So at that point, we have kind of everything in place from a Teams Admin Center perspective. the last piece again goes back to this group policy assignment piece. So what I'm going to do here is show you how to do that through PowerShell. So in my case, I'm going to just do some linking here, and essentially we have a PowerShell commandlet that's essentially going to do this piece. When we do an add here, we can select our group, which is USCO Morrison, Colorado, and that's going to essentially link this group. So any member of this group is going to get this policy, this caller ID policy, for example. Now, what I did was, for my deployment for this Morrison branch, I want every user, so those 7 users in kind of our scope, they're going to get the US Colorado Morrison team shared calling routing policy. They're going to get the calling line identity. They're going to get an emergency calling policy, so that's going to provide a little notification that kind of checks the box to meet Carey's law. I do have a customized Teams calling policy for this branch. We've got a dial plan, emergency call routing policy, call park, call hold, kind of standard, typical voice configuration. And it's all tied back to a single group. Again, that's this group that I call M365 group, US Colorado Morrison shared calling. So basically right now we can see that we don't have any members in here, but if we come back now to any of these policies and we go to the group policy assignment, we can see now that we've got US Colorado Morrison shared calling. This group is assigned to this calling policy. Same with call hold, right? All the policies we just reviewed, they're all linked together now. So the last piece is essentially populating our, actually we've got 2 steps. Here, if I flip back to our deck here, again, this is kind of what we just did here. We took this single group, connected it to all the shared calling policies that we care about. Now we're going to do 2 things. We're going to enable all the users, enterprise voice enabled. That cannot be done via group. Technically, the phone license could be done through the group. I've done that through other means. So let's run this enterprise voice enabled true for my user set. So to do that, we use the set phone number assignment commandlet, and we specify the identity, and we set the enterprise voice enabled flag to true. So here we can see I've got a number of users. I've got a couple of those Teams room devices that we had kind of specified out in this particular sample build. So again, the outcome will be essentially enabling all users and meeting room devices with shared calling with the least amount of overhead possible. So now that all my users are enterprise voice enabled, the only kind of outstanding item to do is add them to unified group. And I need to connect to Exchange to do that. So to add members to a group via PowerShell, again, that's going to be the Exchange Online PowerShell commandlet or module. And then we'll use this add unified group links commandlet. We'll specify the group. And the link type is going to be members, and then we specify all the links. So these are all the UPNs of the users and those room accounts that I want to enable. If we flip back over to here, go to members, hit refresh, we can see that all my users now are essentially in this group. So now there is a little bit of waiting here, but I've got one of the users signed in over on this workstation, so we can see Peter. At this point, Peter does not have a dial pad yet, but we're going to let that bake for just a little bit here, and we will check in on that shortly. So I will get back to the deck here. And Don, J-Dub, can you keep me honest here if things are coming through well there?
Yes,
Yes, things are going well.
Perfect. All right, so that was the live demo. A couple of the considerations that we discuss with our customers is essentially who needs a DID, who doesn't, right? Some organizations I presented this to, and they say, Matt, DIDs are pennies on the dollar. We're just going to give everyone a DID. Other organizations are really embracing this, right? So in today's world, again, not everyone needs a DID. Some do, some don't. It really depends on what that person's job role is, how they interact with the outside world. So that's kind of the first thing when you're kind of, asking yourself or your organization, right? Hey, does shared calling work for us? How many emergency callback numbers does my organization need per shared calling policy, right? Again, US based is probably more of a priority for this question. But I kind of, tell our customers, hey, there is no magic calculator that spits this number out. Part of it is, though, you should think about how many users you're putting in a shared calling policy, right? If you are putting 500, let's say if you're putting 10 users in a shared calling policy, they might only need one emergency callback number. If you're putting 5,000 users in a single shared calling policy, you may need more than one, right? Part of it is maybe looking at your existing 911 calling behavior.
And it looks like Matt just dropped for some reason. And
Yeah.
I think he's just coming back. So
Sorry about that. I don't know what
it
happened
happens.
there.
I can bring the deck back up.
That'd be great, Don. Thank you.
If you want to take control again.
Yes. Thank you.
Yep.
So yeah, this totally depends, right? Think about crisis situations where you might have peak utilization, right? Pick a number and go with it. Do a ratio, right? If for every 100 users, give yourself an emergency callback number, something like that. But think it out. There's some thought that needs to go into that. How many shared calling policies does my organization need? Again, this will vary organization to organization. How do you want to carve this up? Is it by department? Is it by business unit? Is it by office location, global region, right? And part of this could be the driver of what is that shared number. What number are people calling to reach a set of users inbound? What caller ID mask are we presenting outbound? If we have an office in Germany, we may desire to have a local German number. If we are dealing with, California, we might need a local California number. So your mileage may vary there a little bit. And then customizing the experience. So what is the desired inbound experience? Do we even want inbound, right? And I'll talk about a scenario where inbound, we may not want inbound. So again, this can be customized. Some organizations might have a shared calling number it rings into a call queue. Again, the feature was designed to have inbound go into an auto attendant with a dial by name experience. But again, there is some room here for customization to meet your requirements. Couple things to know. So you can use the same resource account in multiple shared calling policies. All the numbers within a given policy must be of the same number type. So again, if you're using direct routing, all your numbers need to be direct routing in a policy. So that includes the shared number and the emergency callback number, etc. And then when you add a resource account to a policy, you must ensure that the number has a location/emergency address assigned to it. So again, I kind of went through that in the demo. If you remove, reassign, report the number, that could cause some failures. And then in some calling plan markets, you aren't allowed to set the location on service numbers. So, reach out to the phone service desk. Again, this next one, Operator Connect, I did kind of preface this early on, right? If you're working with an Operator Connect partner, make sure that they support this capability. Use cases. So this is where we are seeing some excellent traction in some of the customers that we're working with, at least in the health and life sciences business, right? That's where I focus. I know some of my peers in other industries and geos are having similar success stories, but this is a great example, right? Organization has 50,000 employees, 150 offices around the globe, whole variety of different PBXs in different regions and markets. Organizations fully adopted on Teams for chat, collaboration, and meetings. They sign a brand new enterprise agreement, and through that EA, right, they are getting 50,000 Microsoft E5 licenses that include Teams Phone. They select a global Operator Connect partner, and they work to essentially rapidly enable, almost immediately after that enterprise agreement, they want to realize the value of that E5 investment, that Teams Phone investment as soon as possible, not begin a marathon process of a lot of effort. I mean, they're using Teams meetings, Teams calling, adding the dial tone doesn't, and the dial pad to the Teams client does not always have to be, attempting to climb Mount Everest. So what does this organization do? They enable shared calling. They create a single shared calling policy for each office. They allocate, one DID for a local presence, maybe some emergency callback numbers, depending on, again, where those offices are and what geos. The administrator creates 150 auto attendants for that, again, default experience, dial by name, inbound experience. And all E5 licensed users are assigned that shared calling policy. Now, I've been working with Microsoft Voice for quite some time. I mean, I saw organizations do this approach even with Link and Skype for Business back in the day. So as much as this is a new feature to Teams, the concept has been around quite a while for those of you who have been doing this for some time. Right, so the outcome is, 50,000 users can begin using and adopting Microsoft Teams Phone immediately in parallel to their third-party PBX. So we can turn this on in hours, not necessarily months and years, right? It can happen very rapidly if that is your deployment strategy. Then, right, after everybody's enabled using the feature, IT begins to execute that global telephony transformation project. And they start doing the traditional, hey, let's assess an office. Let's see what can be pulled out of there. Maybe we start porting numbers, etc. And maybe we're reducing numbers because we do a PBX assessment that's, and we can identify which handsets are being used, which are not, what phone numbers are being used, which are not. And that allows, organizations to kind of make data-driven decisions on how they can maybe scale back. And And then, we deal with some of the other complexities like auto attendance, call queues, hunt groups, those types of things. And, eventually legacy PBXs may be retired. Help desk. This is another use case, right? Organization is maybe using a legacy PBX. Everybody has Teams. User calls into the help desk answers on that PBX phone, and help desk needs to, look at the end user's computer. The first thing they do is say, hey, I'm going to message you on Teams, and they start sharing their screen, right? So maybe we can simplify some of that workflow as a transition, enable shared calling for those users, and allow them to start using Teams phone, and then we start pulling back the legacy PBX. But again, you can turn it on in parallel with very minimal interruption. Let's see here. Teams rooms. I love this use case. To me, this is a slam dunk use case for shared calling. In this example, we've got an organization deploying, 200 Teams rooms at headquarters to replace legacy conference room technologies. They want to provide outbound dialing in each of these conference rooms, right? Occasionally, rarely, someone may need to walk into one of these conference rooms and call into a legacy conference bridge. I hope that's not happening much anymore, but hey, it does. Organization needs 911, dynamic E911. Let's say they're in the United States. They're using Microsoft calling plans already, and customer has 200 Teams Room Pro license, so they own Teams Phone with that. They enable shared calling policy for 200 rooms with one single pay-as-you-go calling plan, and they don't even want inbound calling for these conference rooms, right? Who wants to get a call inbound in a conference room when you have an important meeting going on, right? It's disruptive. Ideally, we don't even have inbound enabled. So the outcome with shared calling, we have 200 rooms enabled with outbound calling via Teams Phone, leveraging that Teams Room Pro license. We've got one phone number for all 200 rooms, and we allocated, 10 emergency callback numbers. We come up with a simple ratio. And now we look at the benefits, right? We've got one calling plan versus 200. We've got 11 DIDs versus 200. So again, it's just simplified and makes sense. I mean, you don't, and I didn't really talk about this, but it doesn't have to be all or none either, right? Maybe you do have some conference rooms where you need a DID and you want that inbound experience, right? This is the flexibility to mix and match how your organization deploys Teams Phone. And then this last use case I'm going to hit on, again, this is another one that I do think there's value here, again, depending on the organization. 200 remote knowledge workers that are using Cisco Jabber. All the users have E5. Teams is the primary chat and meeting collaboration solution. Organization is moving from Jabber to Teams. They are using a carrier that essentially every user who's going to need a DID, maybe some of the users on Jabber had an extension or something like that. New carrier says, hey, 15 cents per user per month if they want a DID. And hey, by the way, if you want that DID emergency services enabled, it's another 10 cents. So organization, as they're planning this, they hear that, they're like, oh, wow, that's, we didn't quite expect those costs. Even though they've already invested in E5 and have Teams Phone available to them, maybe they start thinking, well, hey, I'm going to scale back. I didn't plan for those costs. And now they're doing kind of the cost avoidance strategy. Instead, right, again, the flexibility of shared calling, now we can enable all the users with shared calling. They can all have dynamic emergency calling, E911, right? And really the outcome here is, the organization's leveraging their E5 with phone. They're still reducing the legacy PBX spend. They're modernizing that calling experience, and they're reducing their telco spend because, again, the initial rollout was 2,000 users, and we're looking at 25 cents a user for just the number and the emergency services. That's $6,000. Hey, flip the table, and now we have one shared number, 20 emergency callback numbers, and we're looking at $62. So keep these scenarios in mind. Again, it's a flexibility thing. It's a rapid deployment thing. There's a lot of benefits. And this is kind of the approach that, we've seen some very large enterprises embrace this feature. And it's, the concept of what we call the reverse migration. So traditional migration, right? For those of you who've done voice migrations, intensive planning, design, and a potentially long deployment runway to get to the finish line. We have an intense assessment of users, personas, stations. We start migrating one by one, hopefully then department by department, and then site by site. Depending on the size and the complexity of your environment, right? This could take a very long time, and you get in that rinse repeat mode. And the cons of that strategy, right, is it takes an incredible amount of time, a lot of resources, which all pretty much equate to money. So it's a big investment to realize the value of your team's phone licensing. So that's where we challenge organizations a little bit. Think about this differently, right? The reverse migration, right? I'm even rocking the shirt today. And the idea is rapidly enable all of your users with Teams Phone deployed in parallel to the existing solution. Maybe it's an outbound only first experience, but it is a very small learning curve for most users to put a dial pad in their existing Teams client and tell them to place a call, right? It's not a super difficult concept. Most users can grab that very quickly and start embracing that, right? Then again, kind of the go back motion is, we have certain partners that we work with that have automated assessments that can help organizations understand where is their little to minimal usage users. And maybe that's how the organization then approaches beginning to retire legacy solutions based on contract expiration, minimal usage, or other business drivers, right? Hey, this PBX is on its last leg. Maybe they go first, we move the numbers over, and they move from shared calling to dedicated calling at that point. But shared calling is kind of the mechanism to put the technology in their hands very quickly and let them start using it and let the organization start realizing that value. Then we create an intake process, right? Maybe this is through ServiceNow or whatnot or users who get on Teams Phone and they love it, right? Hey, this legacy PBX experience was very dated. Teams Phone is great. Can you move my number over? Sure. Go into ServiceNow, put in a ticket. IT is handling these in weekly, monthly batches, right? And you prioritize the users that are asking for it, demanding it ASAP. And again, high adoption of Teams Phone may drive some of these legacy solutions out of the environment sooner than later. This slide I'm not going to get into. Frequently asked questions. So can a shared calling user be a member of a Teams call queue or the new Queues app? If you saw the big announcement in Enterprise Connect, the answer is yes. Does the delegation feature work with shared calling enabled users? Yes, it does. What phone number shows up under the dial pad with shared calling? At this point, no phone number actually does show up under the dial pad. And then is there a limit on the number of concurrent calls supported by a shared number? there will not be a limit on the number of concurrent calls that can be made or received to the shared phone number. And this is the last slide actually I have, and then we can get into some of the Q&A. I've seen the chat kind of beeping along as I've been rambling here. E911, right? You know, obviously we talked about how this works in shared calling, but some of you may be wondering, right, hey, Matt, in that reverse migration concept, you know, that sounds pretty serious, you know, enabling 50,000 users kind of rapidly. Well, what about E911? Great question. And, you know, E911 is a very important topic that cannot be understated. But at the same point, technology has come a long way. So do not let it become a showstopper, right? Talk to your legal, you know, team and understand, you know, what are your organizational requirements? I hear all sorts of different things from different customers as far as what their organization wants them to do. Some of them don't want them using Teams at all if they're not on campus, right? If they're working from home, working anywhere, use a cell phone. I'm not saying that that is necessarily, you know, our recommendation. You know, for one, ask your carrier, hey, do you support PIDFlow, right? PIDFlow is the technical requirement that Teams phone needs on the carrier side in order to send location information and route it accordingly. You know, so that is, you know, needed from your carrier if you want to do dynamic emergency calling. The other piece is talking to your endpoint management team, right? The Teams client is location aware, but your endpoint needs to support that. So if you're using some super old legacy endpoint, it may not have that. Or depending on how you're managing your endpoints, right? Location services could be disabled or, you know, prevented from being enabled. So work with your endpoint management team to make sure that we can make this as easy as possible for your end users. Configure the basic Teams policies, right? Emergency addresses. For one, if you go into your emergency calling policy, flip on location, external location lookup mode. Set up a disclaimer, right, to meet Carrie's law. And, or the notification meets Carrie's law, but the disclaimer, right, you can educate your users, hey, go in there and update your address if you're not working on campus. Confirm it. Train your users how to use this system. If you're using direct routing, make sure you've got an emergency call routing policy. And then, you know, come up with a strategy to populate all your known corporate locations, right? Configuring those emergency addresses, doing the network topology with your trusted IP addresses, and populate your network identifiers. And again, train your users, educate them on how the system works. You know, to me, technology makes this a lot easier than it was. You know, a couple of years ago. And Teams is, you know, it has a lot of the capability to just make this very easy for end users to utilize. But we do need to put some basic framework in place to have those features and functions. All right. Q&A.
Yeah, so good job, Matt. A lot of stuff in there and a lot of things you did answer just after they asked the question. So good job on that. There was one, somebody was asking about this. He thought I saw something, a slide that came through talking about some use cases for clinical and healthcare organizations. Yeah, can you dive into that a little bit?
Yep. Absolutely. So, you know, there's a couple different ways that, you know, I've seen some of our healthcare organizations kind of adopt this, but, you know, the general, I guess, you know, again, it kind of gets into that use case, but how are we trying to, you know, empower potentially clinical workers? Let's say nurses, for example, right? Nurses call patients. Do they need kind of an outbound dial experience? when a nurse calls a patient, typically we want, again, this is kind of my specialty working in HLS, but a lot of times the desired approach there is the nurse is not even going to mask with the shared calling number. They're going to maybe mask with the hospital mainline number, clinic mainline number, so the patient recognizes that. So while we can, again, as the feature was designed, we're going to mask typically with the shared calling number. That doesn't have to be the case, because what I find is a lot of hospital mainline numbers are still ringing into PBX, contact center. So we can have some flexibility on that caller ID mask, depending on what that again, in the example of a nurse, how they want to mask that outbound call. But I don't know if that gets to the exact kind of what that person's looking for done or not.
Yeah, I think that does, definitely. I did see another question, and this is not necessarily shared calling related, but your experience wrapped around, when you're in that dial by name, the auto attendant, there are some organizations that are quite large, right? And they're going to have multiple versions of that name, or the same name, right? So,
Yep.
I mean, anything that you've come across that may help those organizations a little bit with those types of scenarios?
Yeah, so I did talk to a very large organization that did have that challenge, and that challenge kind of persists across any voice platform. If you've got 3 people named Matt Donovan or something like that, right? I mean, the name is redundant. So that's where I kind of challenge organizations to just ask the simple question: is shared calling the right solution for that scenario, right?
Yep.
It's not a one size fits all, and there is room for customization, but if you've got 3 people with the same exact name, and some of the large customers that we work with do have that scenario,
Oh, for sure.
it's going to be a challenge. And that is not a Teams phone specific issue to me. That
that's in general a generic scenario. Yeah. Well, and thinking about how do you scope that shared calling? Maybe it's by a site level or something to be able to get over that. But it is possible you could have that happen at a site level. So there might be some strategies wrapped around being able to get around that. But to your point, yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Good question.
Even had Boris was asking, can you configure, instead of dial by name, can you configure positions instead of names? I mean, it all goes down to that user, right? That user account that's being associated to it. So I think that's part of your strategy, Boris, specifically, and how you're approaching it. And it's all through Entra, right? Azure, or also known as Azure AD, right? And how you have that set up. Good question. How would you track usage stats for this? PSTN, all those types of things. Shared calling obviously would be a part of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I did have a slide that kind of showed that in the PSTN usage report. We do see a special call type. I'll flip back there for a second. So we do see a call type there. I do know that I think it was last Monday, there was the call analytics. The work that a couple of our peers did to, that's the call type. But yeah, I don't know how that new kind of tool set helps, maybe with some advanced reporting there, but that would be another place to kind of pursue.
Yep. Yeah. And Ivan, I think this is kind of what the direction we're talking about right now. Plus, if you're looking for analytics from an auto attendant piece, and I don't remember, did we find out if anything's coming through call quality dashboard yet on any of this information? Yeah, I don't think we've heard that quite yet.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, not quite yet. So, Damien, I highly doubt that this is going to be available in Operator Connect for India quite yet. But that's something that I think as we move forward, we'll find out more information. I'm thinking that's happening here shortly. Okay.
See a question. Are there any good questions that will seed a discussion with networking teams that will help get information needed to implement E911 in shared offices? Yeah, I mean, E911 location, network gathering exercise, I call it. That's never easy. I don't know that there is any magic solution for that. We do have, I like to reference, at least on the Teams blog, Microsoft did share our approach on how we enabled E911 kind of across all of our offices. That may be a reference point, but there is no easy way to gather that network information. I mean, there's a lot of variables there. I guess is probably the better answer.
Exactly. Okay.